Hello, everyone! Now, I'll walk you through the commercial and legal meaning of voting rules in a shareholders agreement, as well as how to set them up. In the shareholders agreement we've designed, all rule objects are defined as 256-bit byte 32 arrays. The system uses a mapping table where the rule number serves as the key and the rule bytecode serves as the value. At runtime, the administrator agreement retrieves the specific rule from this mapping table and calls the system's rule parser, a public contract, to parse the 256-bit byte array back into a structured data object. It then reads the relevant attributes and extracts the required rule data. Each rule has a unique rule number. The previous video covered rule number 0, the general corporate governance rules. This video will cover rules 1 through 255, which are the voting rules. Among these, rules 1 through 7 are assigned to equity transaction matters. 7 numbers are allocated because there are 3 basic types of equity transactions: capital increase transactions, transfers of equity to external third parties, and transfers of equity between existing shareholders. By combining these 3 types, we can get up to 7 different transaction arrangements. For example, an investment agreement that includes both a capital increase and an equity transfer would correspond to one such combination. Therefore, we have set different voting rules for each of these 7 transaction combinations. Rule number 8 is assigned to the special matter of amending the shareholders' agreement itself. The shareholders' agreement is a constitutional document of the company governing almost all general rules of corporate conduct. As such, amending the agreement is a unique matter and is given its own separate voting rule number, Rule 8. Rules 9 and 10 are allocated to resolutions of the general meeting of shareholders. Rule 9 is the simple majority rule for ordinary shareholder resolutions. Rule 10 is the supermajority rule for special matters requiring a higher threshold. Rules 11 and 12 are assigned to board voting matters. Rule 11 is the simple majority rule for board resolutions. Rule 12 is the supermajority rule for board resolutions. Next, based on the white paper, we'll analyze the attributes of the structured data object within the voting rules. First attribute, sequence of rule. As mentioned earlier, rule numbers 1 through 255 are reserved for voting rules, occupying 1 byte, which is 2 to the 8th power, allowing flexible numbering. The system has pre-reserved numbers 1 through 12 for different matters. The second and third attributes have no substantive meaning for voting rules, so we won't go into them. Next attribute, authority. This is the code for the decision-making body to which the voting rule applies. There are 2 types. Code 1 represents the general meeting of shareholders. Code 2 represents the board of directors. Next attribute, head ratio. This is the minimum passing threshold calculated by head count. It answers, if we count by the number of right holders, what is the minimum percentage needed for the matter to pass? Next attribute, amount ratio. This is similar to head ratio, but instead of head count, it uses voting power. In other words, what is the threshold to 50%, 60%, or 66.67% required for passage based on voting power? These can all be set flexibly. Next attribute, only attendance. This one needs a bit of explanation. It asks, should we only count the votes of those who actually participated in the vote? More specifically, should only those who actually cast a vote, whether yes, no, or abstain, be included in the denominator? If you choose true, only those who actually voted are counted. If you choose false, all right holders with voting rights are included in the denominator, regardless of whether they actually voted. Next attribute, implied consent. This means, for those who did not vote, do we treat them as agreeing to the proposal by default? If you choose true, non-voters are considered to have consented. If you choose false, non-voters are considered to have disagreed. Next attribute, party as consent. This one is a bit more complex. Let me explain. If the matter being voted on is the approval of a legal document, the signatories to that document, the parties to the contract, are, by default in the system, not entitled to vote. They must recuse themselves. But here's the question. should these recused parties be included in the denominator of the vote count? That's what the party as consent attribute controls. If you choose true, the recused parties are included in the denominator and their head count and voting power are also added to the numerator, effectively treating them as consenting by default. If you choose false, these recused parties are completely excluded from the denominator. They are kept out due to the recusal rule, and only non-signatory non-interested right holders are counted. They are also excluded from the numerator. This attribute is quite special, so it's important to understand it clearly. First, the system defaults to preventing relevant parties from voting on any matter in which they have a direct interest. In practice, you'll notice that if you are a signing party, the voting button will not be available to you. Second, if you want these recused right holders to be treated as consenting, choose true. If you don't want them counted at all, choose false. Next attribute, against shall buy. This means, if a right holder votes against a proposal, are they required to purchase the target shares on the same terms? If you choose true, the opposing party is obligated to purchase on the same terms. If you choose false, they have no such obligation. In the private equity and venture capital space, this is typically set to false, meaning that even though I may oppose a transaction, I am not required to buy the shares. As a side note, here's the default rule under Chinese company law. If a shareholder disagrees with an equity transfer arrangement, they are required to purchase on the same terms. Otherwise, their negative vote will not have legal effect. Of course, we can override this default through the company's articles of association, or in our system, through a special provision in the shareholders' agreement. The next several attributes are all numbers of days. They control the timing of the voting process. To help you understand, let's look at the following simple diagram of the voting procedure. This diagram graphically shows the relationship between the various time nodes in an equity transaction. The first time point is day 0, also called the proposed date. This is the date on which a shareholder submits an equity transfer or capital increase proposal to the general meeting for consideration. The next time point is the first refusal exercise deadline. This is the last date on which right holders can exercise their right of first refusal. The period between the proposed date and this deadline is defined as the FR exercise period. When setting up the voting rules, this period is measured in days. For example, if you enter 1, that means the ROFR period is 1 day. Starting from the proposed date, the right holder has 24 hours or 86,400 seconds to exercise their preemptive right or right of first refusal. The next time point is the drag-along or tag-along exercise deadline. The period between the FR deadline and this deadline is the exercise period for drag-along or tag-along rights. This period is also measured in days. The next time point is the drag-along or tag-along confirmed deadline. This deadline is for the buyer. If tag-along or drag-along rights are exercised, that means the buyer needs to purchase additional shares. At this point, the buyer has an opportunity to decide whether to accept the arrangement. If they accept, they purchase the additional shares. If not, the entire transaction is terminated. The next time point is the share registration date. This point is extremely important. Only those who hold shares in the company as of this date have the corresponding voting rights. For example, if a shareholder transferred their shares to a third party before the share registration date, it is the third party transferee, not the original shareholder, who has the right to vote. The period between the drag-along-tag-along confirmation deadline and the share registration date is defined as the investment exit period. During this window, shareholders have the opportunity to transfer their shares and exit their investment in the target company. The next time point is the vote start date. The period between the share registration date and the vote start date is defined as the voting preparation period. Like the others, this period is also set in days within the voting rules. Next is the vote end date. The period between the vote start date and the vote end date is the voting period, also measured in days. The final time point is the request to buy deadline. This attribute is used together with the against shall buy attribute. If we specify that those who vote against are required to buy the target shares on the same terms, then the period between the vote end date and the request to buy deadline is the exercise period during which the original selling shareholder can exercise this right. In the system's rules, this is also measured in days. So those are the basic definitions of all the time periods. Next, there is a very important attribute, the user IDs of the veto holders. In each voting rule, we can enter up to 2 user IDs of veto holders. What does this mean? During the deliberation of a specific proposal, if the right holder corresponding to this ID casts a negative vote, then no matter how others vote, regardless of their voting results, the proposal is directly rejected. However, I should add a clarifying note. In fact, veto arrangements can also be achieved using the amount ratio attribute we discussed earlier. For example, if an investor holds 15% of the target company's shares, you could set the supermajority threshold for special matters at 90%. That means unless the investor votes in favor, the proposal can never pass. In effect, this creates a unanimous consent requirement. The proposal passes only if the investor agrees. That is essentially a veto arrangement. Conversely, if we use the designated user ID method to create a veto right, that means even if an investor holds a very small percentage of shares and voting power, they can still have a 1-vote veto right. Now that we've covered these attributes, let's switch over to the system and see how to set up voting rules in practice. Once you open the system, you'll see that in the voting rules section, 12 rules have already been set by default. Of course, you can also click the plus button to add new voting rules on your own. Let's click one open and take a look at what attribute fields are available for you to freely create and configure. The first field is authority. As we explained earlier, there are 2 options: the general meeting of shareholders or the board of directors. This simply tells you which decision-making body this voting rule applies to. The second attribute is head ratio, the minimum passing percentage based on head count. You can enter a number such as 20%. That would mean that in a board voting rule, if a proposal receives more than 20% of directors' votes in favor, it passes and is approved by the board. The next attribute is amount ratio, the minimum percentage based on voting power. For example, if you set it to 66.67%, that means if 2/3 or more of shareholders approve, the proposal passes the general meeting vote. Next are the exercise days for put option. As we explained earlier, if a rule requires shareholders who vote against to purchase the target shares on the same terms, how many days do they have to exercise that right? You enter that number here. For example, if they need to exercise within 7 days, enter 7. The starting point for this period is the vote end date we discussed earlier. Next attribute, class. This defines which shareholders are allowed to participate in the vote, meaning it determines which class or classes of shares are entitled to vote on the matter. If you enter 0 here, the voting process does not distinguish by share class, all shareholders vote together. If you enter a number greater than 0, the system will determine which shareholders are eligible to vote based on the shareholder classes you set up when initializing the equity bookkeeping system. For example, suppose you set founder shares as Class 1 and Series A investor shares as Class 2. If you enter 1 here, only shareholders holding Class 1 shares, the founders, can vote. If you enter 2, only Class 2 shareholders, the Series A investors, can vote, and so on. When counting votes, the system will calculate based only on the voting weight of the relevant share classes. Next is only attendance. This determines whether we only count those who actually voted. Should those who have voting rights but did not participate be counted in the denominator? True means they are counted. False means they are not. Next is implied consent. This determines whether non-voters are treated as having agreed. True means non-voters are considered to have consented. False means non-voters are considered to have disagreed. Typically, we choose false. Next is party as consent. As explained earlier, this asks, should the recused contracting parties be counted in the voting results? If you choose true, their head count or voting weight is included in the numerator as consenting votes and also included in the denominator. If you choose false, this means a complete recusal arrangement. The contracting parties are not counted at all in the voting results. Next is against shall buy. This asks, does a shareholder who votes against have the obligation to purchase the target shares on the same terms? Choose true if yes, false if no. The next two fields are the user IDs of the veto holders. If you want a specific shareholder to have veto power, enter their user ID here. You can enter up to 2 IDs. However, in most cases, using the amount ratio to control unanimous consent matters is already sufficient, and you typically don't need to manually enter user IDs. This is a relatively special arrangement. Finally, the last set of fields are used to control the timeline of the voting process. First is the OFR exercise period in days. This period starts from the proposed date. For example, if you enter 7 days, that means starting from the proposed date. Right holders have 7 days to exercise their preemptive rights or rights of first refusal. After 7 days, the opportunity is gone. Second is the exercise period for tag-along or drag-along rights. This period is measured in days. It starts from the OFR exercise deadline. For example, you could also enter 7 days here. Third is the confirmation period for the buyer in a tag-along or drag-along arrangement. This is the period during which the buyer, as the counterparty to the transaction, must state their position. The buyer can agree by saying, I am willing to buy more shares, or they can disagree by saying, I no longer wish to proceed with this transaction, or simply not respond, in which case the transaction will not move forward. For example, we could enter 8 days. Next is the investment exit period. As we introduced earlier, this is the period before the share registration date during which existing shareholders have the opportunity to transfer their shares to a third party and exit their investment in the target company. That said, this situation is relatively rare in practice because it requires the existence of freely tradable shares. In other words, shareholders can only exit in this way if the shares do not need to be voted on under the special provisions of the shareholders' agreement. So this attribute is really designed for companies with publicly traded shares, quasi-listed companies. For the sake of example, let's say 7 days. Next are the vote prepared days, the number of days for the voting preparation period. This is the period between the share registration date and the vote start date. For example, we could enter 2 days. In the context of listed companies, sometimes there is no preparation period at all. The share registration closes at the end of one trading day, and voting can begin the next day when the market opens. However, in our on-chain voting process, there is no market opening or trading hour restriction, so we can set this flexibly. 1 day means 24 hours. 2 days means 48 hours. Finally, the voting days, the voting period itself. This is the window of time during which everyone can cast their votes. The question is, how many days are available to vote? Entering 1 day means 24 hours. 2 days means 48 hours. The unit of time is simply days. So let's pick a number, and after entering all the values, click Update. As always, before clicking Update, make sure you switch to the Agreement Drafter user. After you click Update, this voting rule will be updated in the system's shareholders agreement. That's all for today's video. Thank you for your time, and see you in the next video.